Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for the Resilient Energy Studio info session. My name is Kate Shubik, and I'm a program director with the New Lab team. And along with my colleague, Tom Conboy, who you will meet shortly, have been leading the Resilient Energy Studio with our partners at the New York City Economic Development Corporation and Con Edison. So I'm going to kick us off with a brief introduction of New Lab. Then I'm going to turn it over to Tom to provide more details about the studio and the open call opportunity. We'll then hear from the New York City Economic Development Corporation, and we'll wrap up towards the end with a question and answer section. So a quick note that you can submit questions you have at any time through the Q&A feature on Zoom. And then also a note that we'll be recording this session and sharing it with everybody who RSVP'd. So you'll be able to pass it along or also reference it again if needed. So with that, I'm happy to jump in. Some of you may be familiar with New Lab, but for those of you who are not, New Lab is a community of experts and innovators on a mission to apply transformative technology to help solve major industry and civic challenges. And we work toward this mission in 4 primary ways. First is our membership community. So New Lab is home to over 200 companies that are working in emerging technologies, ranging from AI to robotics to material science. And we have a team that's dedicated to supporting our entrepreneurs and providing a suite of digital and physical resources that help these companies grow and scale their businesses. The second is our innovation studios. So this is New Lab's nomenclature for our innovation programs, in which we partner with Fortune 500 companies or government organizations that have either a business challenge or a social mission that they're looking to deliver on that can be addressed with emerging technology. And they're really seeking a dedicated channel for being able to identify and work with cutting edge solutions that are relevant to them. And the other 2 elements of our business are our venture studio. So this is where we collaborate and partner with leading entrepreneurs to spin up new companies and new ventures, and our investment efforts, where we play a big role in helping to syndicate deals with our network of over 600 investors. And so this next slide is a nice kind of bird's eye view of some New Lab stats that help bring our business and community to life a bit more. So I'll just touch on a few of these, but as I mentioned, we support over 200 member companies, which represent a collective value of $4.2 billion and have raised north of $1.5 billion in funding. We have 110,000 square feet of space that's spread across 2 locations, which includes prototyping labs, collaborative workspaces and private offices for our member community, conference rooms, and several event spaces as well. We also have a full-time product realization team that's on site and oversees over $5 million of on-site equipment that helps our various community members that are working in hardware take a concept from just an idea to a full working prototype. And here, just want to note, so New Lab's headquarters, where I'm actually based today, is in Brooklyn, New York. It's in a former shipbuilding facility within the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which is a 300-acre industrial campus that operates a lot like a mini city. And the really great element of that is that it functions as kind of a living lab for our member companies to be able to test out products and iterate on their solutions in our own backyard here in Brooklyn. But also want to note that we're very excited to be expanding into our first physical location outside of New York City, which will be Detroit later this year. We're solidifying those plans, but we are currently operating out of a beta space in Detroit. So very much kind of present in that market at the moment and excited for that expansion to come. And, wanted to highlight a couple of additional stats here. We're really proud to be home to a dynamic community of members. We have 23% of our member companies that are led by a female founder. 70% of our founders have a master's degree or a doctorate. 39% are serial entrepreneurs, and 38% have actually relocated to our headquarters here in Brooklyn, New York, from outside of the area. And really just a way to kind of show that the New Lab ecosystem is representative of a diverse set of perspectives, which is really important to our team here, and important to us to be supporting this base of members. And then I wanted to spend some time just zooming in on New Lab's innovation studios, since this is really what brings us together today at this info session. As I mentioned at the start, New Lab partners with corporations, government organizations, and other entities to run innovation studios around an industry or a civic challenge. And these studios really provide a neutral platform from which innovators, industry leaders, entrepreneurs, and various domain experts can iterate and test emerging solutions against specific use cases or hypotheses, with an emphasis on de-risking technology and helping to scale promising solutions around that challenge. So on the right hand of the slide here, you'll see a few examples of the types of studios that we run. So in partnership with Verizon, we have a 5G studio that tests the capabilities of different technologies over a 5G node that we have installed in our new lab building here. Prior to the Resilient Energy Studio, which you'll hear more about in a second, we actually ran a different studio called the Circular City Studio with the New York City Economic Development Corporation, in which we were seeking promising solutions to help decarbonize New York City. And in partnership with Ford Motor Company, as part of our work in Detroit, we ran the Mobility Studio, which is really designed to advance technologies and products aimed at the transition to an electrified, connected, and autonomous future. So this just gives you a little bit of kind of the breadth of different industries and different types of partners New Lab has worked with and is continuing to work with. And then lastly, just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about how these innovation studios are run so everyone has that context. So they typically run for 12 to 18 months and follow the kind of 5 key phases that you see here. So first is the kickoff, in which New Lab and the studio partner align on the strategic focus areas to address through the studio and what the criteria for success are. So what are we really working toward in this studio? Next, we undertake a generative research process, and this is really to ground the studio in a strong understanding of the focus area. So we speak with relevant stakeholders, we conduct our own secondary research, we identify a large set of interesting technologies and products that could be applied through the studio, all to make sure that we're gaining conviction around the areas that are really important to address and some of the key challenges that are emerging in that focus area. And then the convene phase is where we recruit relevant startups from across the world to apply to the studio. This is where we are right now in the Resilient Energy Studio. And once the studio selects a cohort of startups to participate, these teams then develop pilot project proposals in collaboration with New Lab, the studio partner, and relevant pilot sites or strategic collaborators, again, with an eye toward deploying their pilots with the support of the studio team behind them. So that's that pilot phase. And then lastly, as these pilots start to come to a close, this is present throughout the entire process, but the studio team is really cognizant of working with each startup to facilitate an ongoing relationship with the studio partner or other relevant stakeholders that have been engaged throughout to really create that foundation and runway for continued work together and to see these solutions be on a sustainable path. And that's just kind of a nice little bird's eye view of, again, how these innovation studios operate to kind of provide that context for everyone on the call. And with that, I'm going to invite my colleague Tom on screen now to share more about the Resilient Energy Studio specifically.
Perfect. Thank you, Kate. As Kate mentioned, I'm Tom Comboy. I'm a program manager here at New Lab, and I'm focused on this Resilient Energy Studio effort in partnership with EDC and in collaboration with Con Ed. So I'm going to walk us through the studio, just starting with a high-level overview. Then we'll talk a little bit about what it means to pilot through the studio. We'll get into focus areas, a little bit of an overview on some potential pilot sites that we are thinking about. And then go through a timeline of events. So we'll start with the high-level overview. The Resilient Energy Studio is in partnership with the New York City Economic Development Corporation and also in collaboration with Con Edison. We have a top-level mission to cultivate local energy storage capacity by working with entrepreneurs, community organizations, energy experts, and industry stakeholders. Our goal is to advance energy storage in the 5 boroughs in the urban environment of New York City for a sustainable urban future. So the efforts of the studio, from research to piloting, is designed to support goals critical to New York City's and New York State's climate agenda by advancing pilot projects to catalyze energy storage solutions that fit local needs in New York City. So, with that high-level overview, what does it actually mean to pilot through the studio? So it can be organized under these 3 columns. I'll start first with build and pilot. what does it mean to actually get your pilot off the ground and implemented in New York City? So Kate had alluded to a lot of this in the New Lab overview, but you'll be receiving a lot of structured support from the New Lab team to advance your pilot concept, solicit feedback on feasibility and things like that. Beyond just the New Lab team, the EDC team and Con Edison, as well as our stakeholder network, will be available to navigate the pathways of implementing energy storage in New York City. And the pilot sites that I'm going to mention in a further slide will also be available, just to help. It'll be a team effort to launch these pilots. The next column is investment and exposure. The studio has a total grant funding pool of up to $240,000 to help offset the costs of piloting. Those familiar with piloting energy storage know that that is not intended to cover the entire cost of the project. It's more an offset to de-risk technology in New York City. And I'll note there that there's no equity taken in the process of dispersing that funding. Collaboration with pilot site hosts, EDC, and Con Ed will remain. New Lab, as Kate also mentioned, you'll receive access to a wide network of angel investors that are interested in companies like yours facilitating the energy transition. EDC as well remains available through the wide gamut of their economic development priorities in the city. And then in terms of New Lab's community and space, I'm also here at the Navy Yard today. We have over 200 companies scaling transformative technologies here. We have an advisor network, and we have a great prototyping space, over 84,000 square feet of space to work on hardware. So I'll move to the next slide. And this is where I'm going to go over our 4 focus areas. These are focus areas that were informed by our research and talking to, as I mentioned at the top, industry, entrepreneurial, community, government stakeholders. This is what they told us they wanted to see. And we designed these 4 focus areas to kind of capture different things that we deemed important. So I'll go through each one, give a little bit of a context as to the why behind each one. And then please absolutely put your questions in the Q&A and we can chat more about them later. So first focus area is safer energy storage for dense urban environments. This is energy storage in the 5 boroughs of New York City under the regulatory jurisdictions of the Department of Buildings and FDNY. If you're familiar with New York City, you may know that it can be somewhat of a difficult process to navigate that landscape and implement, as well as required safety testing. So what we're looking for here is the right mix of safety, energy density, and cost, that kind of formula that will really work best in urban environments in New York City. The why behind this is we realize that there's a dearth of technologies here due to the regulatory environment and just difficulty of getting approved, getting cited, and also often making projects make financial sense. So new technologies that have advantages in those 3 areas will be most feasible here. Our second focus area showcase community impacts of energy storage. Our community focus, our environmental justice focus, is really throughout the studio, but it especially comes through here. This is a simulation opportunity, and it's really thinking about the goalpost or the vision. What does energy storage look like in a community 10 years from now that we should be planning towards and thinking towards? What do distributed energy resources look like at various different building sites throughout a neighborhood? So again, this is more of a simulation opportunity. It's designed to provide outputs that will help community organizations advocate for the right types of energy storage that's most cost advantageous, environmentally friendly. That's particularly in the face of increasing energy storage deployments in New York State. Our third focus area is demonstrate novel emerging energy storage solutions. So I would sort of contrast this a bit to the first focus area. This is the more out of the box, novel, innovative energy storage technologies, including alternative battery chemistries, things like kinetic energy storage, long duration energy storage. It's a very wide net. But anything that's really innovative that may hold promise for implementation in New York City. I'll get into our pilot site partners, but we're thinking of piloting this outside of the jurisdiction of FDNY, just to allow for some more bespoke testing of the system. And that may take place in National Park Service territory in South Brooklyn. Our fourth focus area is integrating electric vehicles and energy storage assets. So this is the world of electric vehicles as batteries, harnessing that large battery that's inside a vehicle when it's parked, electric vehicle chargers, stationary storage, as well as buildings in New York City, which potentially may have generation assets, for example, solar on the roof. How are all of those different pieces talking to one another, communicating and optimized and exchanging energy in the most cost-effective way? So there's a few different angles here. For example, storage-enabled charging, or just working on the actual software optimization of things, for example. But it's all about understanding how this dynamic load management between those different assets will play out in the best way in the 5 boroughs. So I'll move forward now to our potential pilot site partners. So these are partners that we've been talking to as we've been progressing through our research phase and working towards this open call. They have all indicated an interest in potentially serving as a pilot host through the studio. They may be interested in reviewing applications and learning more about proposals. And they hope to serve as pilot site hosts. So I'll just go clockwise here. The EDC has assets throughout the city. They're interested in energy storage integration into a wide variety of properties. One that I'll mention is Hunts Point in the South Bronx as a particular interest. The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, you're all familiar with LaGuardia, with JFK. There's also a container terminal in Red Hook, just one of a few properties the Port Authority has. Jamaica Bay Rockaway Parks Conservancy is partnering with us via Gateway National Recreation Area, which is part of the National Park Service. So it's really South Brooklyn and Queens and Jamaica Bay, as well as part of the southern shore of Staten Island. And then the Brooklyn Navy Yard, of course, it's where we are today. They're very interested in opportunities that come out of the studio. And Con Edison, citywide, but also in relation to an energy test bed in Long Island City. So just underscoring very wide variety of partners that are very interested in the applications that will come through this open call process. So I'll turn now to a timeline. This is just to give you an overview of where we are and where we're going. So we launched our open call a few weeks ago. Right now we're right in between this bullet point 1 and bullet point 2. You're at our first info session. If there's anyone you'd like to recommend, attend our next info session that will be on May 19th, and we'll be sending out an email. The open call closes on June 1st. So that is the deadline to submit applications on our website. We'll then move into a review process and notify finalists towards August. We'll have a launch in September. We'll design and deploy pilots from September through about March of next year, baking in a lot of flexibility there for the different types of pilots that we'll run. For example, a simulation versus a very plug and play physical energy storage system versus a very custom stationary storage system, for example. And then we will wrap up studio activities with a public showcase event next spring. So that's just an overview of our timeline. Happy to answer any questions on that as well in a bit. In the meantime, what I'd like to do is invite Nick Kraus, who is a senior project manager at EDC, up on the screen. We'd love to just get, for you all, a little bit of a perspective on EDC's involvement in the studio and their priorities. So Nick, great to have you with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Tom.
So I think first we're curious, what is EDC's vision for New York City's energy future? How does EDC support the city's efforts to transition to clean and sustainable energy?
Yeah, so here at EDC, we're really working every day in support of New York City's goals as it relates to decarbonization and clean energy. And I'm sure many of y'all are familiar with this, but New York City has the most aggressive goals in the country. We've committed to 100% clean electricity by 2040 and carbon neutrality by 2050. And so these targets are really going to require a cataclysmic shift to renewable energy from many sources, from rooftop solar to utility scale renewables. And of course, energy storage is a really important part of this equation. So at EDC, we're working across the energy ecosystem to support these goals. We are the principal city stakeholder in the city's new offshore wind vision plan, which is committed to building an equitable offshore wind sector here in New York City. New York State is leading the country in our commitment to offshore wind with 9 gigawatts committed by 2035, and that number could rise all the way up to 20 gigawatts. We're also working at EDC on the decarbonization of our own assets that we control via the deployment of distributed energy resources and battery storage. And we're partnering with other city agencies focused on decarbonization to advance their goals collectively. So this is kind of a long-winded way of saying we're working on a number of fronts, and we're really excited about this studio because we see battery storage as the connective tissue between a lot of these different projects.
Yeah, it's definitely great to hear EDC getting involved in so many different pieces of the puzzle here. Can you talk to us more about EDC's motivation around energy storage, around urban energy storage solutions in New York City? How do you see this Resilient Energy Studio supporting those goals?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, as I mentioned, we really do see battery storage or urban energy storage as this connective piece that ties together a lot of different renewable energy sources. And EDC hasn't really yet taken a bold stance and made a big investment into the battery storage sector. So we're really excited that this studio will be a cornerstone of our work supporting innovation in the space. Like I said, we really need to have storage capacity in New York City to respond to misalignments between demand and production supply. And storage will also meaningfully improve grid resilience, allowing for backup power in times of power supply interruptions. So it's just this absolutely critical piece. And we see the studio as a really important first step that we're taking at EDC in partnership with New Lab to help de-risk some of the promising technology that will pave the way for broader scale energy deployment in the city and create really clear use cases for technology that's going to help us create a resilient future here. So one kind of last thought here is that, while we see the studio as an initial piece, as a way to stand up discrete pilots and de-risk specific technologies, we really hope too that inputs from the studio and successful technologies that pilot here will be deployed at a larger level across the city in the future and inform our broader strategy as it relates to storage.
Awesome. Yeah. And I think we really work to weave that through the 4 focus areas, focusing on real sort of pain points in the energy storage ecosystem right now. So in terms of these pilot projects that we're working towards into the fall and into next year, What should the folks that are attending today, entrepreneurs considering applying to the studio, have top of mind as they're thinking about and writing their applications?
Yeah, one piece that's really critical that I haven't spoken to yet is that at EDC, we don't believe that these technologies exist in a vacuum. We really want to see companies that are thinking about who benefits from this technology and the community relationship to the tech. As I'm sure you're all familiar with, there is a really troubling and fraught history of environmental injustice in the city. And so as we think about deploying and implementing technology that's going to facilitate the transition to renewables, we want to be sure that we're keeping disproportionately affected communities in mind. So technologies that are clear about not only the tech value that they deliver to the to battery storage, but also the community benefits that their tech can engender is really important to us as an agency. And another thing that we want to see too are technologies that find value in excitement and complex challenges. You all are probably familiar with this too, but navigating Fire Department of New York FDNY regulations, the city's red tape, and other hurdles is really cumbersome, but it's also a hugely valuable exercise to clarify pathways to storage deployment in the city and to think about ways we can really do this at scale. So we're also looking for companies that say yes with enthusiasm to challenges and have a demonstrated track record of deploying in complex environments.
Yeah, I think those that can sort of weave the advantages in their technology with all of the soft things that come along with it that we've been touching on will be really strong applicants. So another question is, from your perspective, what does success look like for teams participating in the studio?
Sure. So yeah, this is an interesting question because I think on one hand, success will be something that we define together with the companies that we select to pilot. We'll work together to determine KPIs that we can measure that are meaningful to both the startups participating and to EDC and New Labs. So, on a very tangible, measurable level, that's something we can work out in tandem. But on a broader kind of macro level, we're definitely looking for companies that think about success in a larger societal context. Like I said, we want to think about how benefits can extend to communities and New Yorkers beyond just the pilot site itself. So people that are thinking about the accretive benefits to society and disaffected or disproportionately affected communities, that's something we really love to see, and we love to bake in our thinking of success. Broadly, I also think that we want to walk away from pilots feeling comfortable that the technologies that have been piloted could be deployed at an enterprise level across the 5 boroughs and inform, like I said, our broader storage strategy. So we really want to feel a good conviction too that we could deploy beyond just this discrete pilot site.
Great. And final question for you. In EDC's eyes, why is now a critical time to pilot energy storage technologies in the 5 boroughs? How do you think these pilots are poised to really move the needle in the energy storage industry in the city?
Yeah, I like to think of that quote that I'm totally going to butcher, but it's like the best time to plant a tree was 10 years ago, but the second best time is today. I really feel that applies when it comes to something like battery storage, because the demands of the climate crisis and the need to decarbonize the energy system are just so profound and pressing that we need to be advancing promising technologies right now in this complex urban environment. It's just absolutely critical. Another thing too, just more pragmatically, is that there are going to be a lot of renewables coming online in the next decade in New York City, from solar to offshore wind projects to all sorts of different renewable technology. And so we need to be ready to have battery storage in place. We need to have clarified pathways to deployment because, like I said, batteries are that connective tissue. And then finally, I think we're just thrilled too about the progress and sector maturation that's happened recently with the battery storage sector. We know that the technology has come a long way in a short period of time. And so there's no time like the present to really get into live environments and see how that tech works in the broader social context.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point about renewables expanding, New York State just doubled their energy storage target earlier by 2030 earlier this year.
Right. Yeah, we really have just some incredible tailwinds. And so we need to capitalize on that and just use our resources to push things further more quickly.
Totally. Great. So I'd like to invite Kate Shubik back, and we'll do a little Q&A now.
Awesome. Excellent. Great. So I'm going to start with one of the first questions that has come in. So Tom, the question is, can pilots be deployed at commercial spaces or buildings?
Yes. So the answer to that is yes. They can be deployed at commercial spaces and buildings. I think there will be sort of an extra scoping process involved there in terms of like business needs and whether the pilot makes sense. But yes, residential, commercial, and while we foresee this coming to fruition a bit less than the first two categories, industrial spaces as well are eligible.
Awesome. Excellent. Another question would be, can you talk a little bit more about who is eligible to apply to the studio and maybe some of the kind of characteristics or qualifications the review committee will be keeping an eye out for?
Absolutely. So early stage hardware and software companies, as well as researchers with solutions and capabilities that are well suited to deploy energy storage concepts specifically in New York City. That's definitely who we're looking to apply to the studio. So there's a few things that come with that, which we've been sort of hinting at as we go through. Teams should come equipped with some knowledge and understanding of the safety testing requirements that are necessary to generally site energy storage anywhere, but also the extra restrictions or requirements, I should say, of New York City, as well as a basic understanding of the permitting process and the approval process from regulators in New York City. And then just alongside that, they should, we're going to be working through a lot as we work to launch pilots, site systems and get them online. There will be some things to work through here. So working in an open, collaborative manner with New Lab, with EDC, with Con Ed, with all of our stakeholders involved. And really just leveraging learnings to help advance the energy storage ecosystem as a whole, sharing what we've learned, sharing the clarity in those pathways, as Nick was mentioning. That's where the studio can really generate value for the energy storage ecosystem in the city.
Perfect. Great. Thank you so much for that answer. So you had mentioned, here's another question. You had mentioned that, pilots will look to start to wrap up in the spring of next year. Can you talk a little bit about kind of what happens when pilots conclude or kind of when the studio wraps up? What can participants expect?
So once the studio wraps, I said up front that we have a pilot launch period of sort of September to March. That's a very flexible timeline. So whether pilots are kind of like early and ready to deploy in the fall, that's great. If it takes the groundwork to get them launched towards the end of that period, that's okay. A big focus of the studio will just be discourse and awareness. It will be taking the learnings of the pilot projects, of the simulations that I described, and just sharing them and making them available to the community. So there will be follow-on opportunities to work with our pilot partners, to work with Con Ed, to work with EDC. And then we're also working towards a spring public showcase of the outcomes of the studio.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Just had another question come in. Would you consider sustainable or circular waste to energy projects that are well suited to an urban environment? I may be happy to take a stab at this one. And Tom, if you have anything to add, I would say
Sure.
certainly for the purposes of the Resilient Energy Studio, as Tom indicated, we kind of have those 4 core focus areas that are really oriented around energy storage capabilities and technologies. So it's definitely important that any solutions that are being submitted are relevant and kind of attached to energy storage advancement. So I would keep that in mind, but I would say, certainly New Lab generally is working in a number of different spaces and interested in a variety of technologies and solutions outside of the studio we've presented today. So our team is always interested in any type of cutting edge technologies, especially in the sustainability realm, as this question alludes to. So more than happy to talk about your technology and where there might be overlap. And then I think just more broadly, I would say, if you're on this info session and you think that maybe your technology or solution is related, but you're not sure exactly what focus area it fits into, or if you have some questions, you have our email address up right here, resilientenergy@newlab.com. Both Tom and I are more than happy to field conversations with anyone who's interested to talk through what you have in mind, what your application might be, what technology you might have, and can definitely help you think through that. So certainly if you're on the fence or if you have clarifying questions about your technology specifically, our team's more than happy to chat with you as you consider an application. Anything else there, Tom?
No, I think you really hit it on the head there, and we're happy to speak more about that separately. Yeah.
Perfect. Great. So just a couple more questions I think we have here. Since I just mentioned focus areas, this is a timely one. Can I submit an application for more than one focus area?
So the short answer to that is no, but don't worry. We asked you frame your application around one focus area. You heard me break them down. They kind of each have a different theme and they're each intended to produce a little bit of a different learning. That being said, we are not putting things into segmented buckets and only reviewing applications in comparison to the focus area that you've selected. We'll be evaluating across the 4 focus areas. So if the review team thinks that your application is actually a better fit for one of the other focus areas, we're happy to make that connection and reach out to you. So just select one, but don't worry so much about only being considered for that category.
Great. That is definitely helpful. Okay, great. And then we have another question here about what would be the timing of cash flows of the grant. So I'm happy to also jump in on this one. Typically the way that we handle the grant, the distribution of the grant for our studio programs is in, kind of tranches throughout the program that we would be very clear about upfront with the selected teams. So generally the first order of business once a team is selected is to really detail out a pilot project proposal. So getting into real specifics around timelines, stakeholders engaged, expected KPIs and outcomes. And we consider that kind of a milestone or an element that needs to be delivered on to release the first tranche of funding. So there's definitely, we orient it in a way so that there's some immediate cash flow coming from the grant in order to be able to help, again, offset those costs. So it doesn't all come at the end of the studio, it doesn't all come at the beginning, but we're making sure we're structuring it in a way that you have a clear expectation of when you can expect the various grant amounts to be available to you. And that's another question. If there's any follow-ups, we're certainly happy to discuss that in more detail live individually if anyone has more questions on that, but that's what you can expect there. And I think another question that just came in is how many projects or teams will be accepted into the studio?
Yeah, so we anticipate selecting 3 to 5 teams to participate in this studio. I will just say that will be influenced by pilot feasibility and the level of effort that it will require. It's no secret that launching energy storage projects in New York City can be cumbersome. So there'll be a lot to work through. That'll be a major factor. But our target at the moment is 3 to 5 teams.
Perfect. Great. And maybe a question we can wrap with, but certainly if any others come to mind, feel free to submit them. But a question around, will there be an opportunity to engage further with some of the Partners Con Ed, EDC, or potential pilot sites once pilots are launched?
Yeah, so the short answer to that is yes. First, I'll just re-mention that our pilot site partners will be engaged throughout the studio's pilot activities. If they would like to run with an application, they'll be there at the table. That's something that we've previewed with them, helping to facilitate the pilot strategy, KPIs, reviewing outcomes, as well as chatting about follow-on paths for engagement with you. So yes, totally.
Okay, awesome, great. And one question that just came in is there a cost share match? Not sure if I'm going to answer this exactly because I'm not sure if I'm understanding it, but in terms of is there a cost share match, like if an applicant were to put up X amount of money, if that's kind of matched in terms of the funding? The short answer is no. The way that the funding works, as Tom mentioned, is we have a non-dilutive pool of grant funding that's right around 240K, and that's going to be distributed amongst the 3 to 5 teams that are selected. So that's kind of that's the funding pool that we're working with. You'll see as you go through the application, there are questions around budgetary considerations. Certainly as teams are applying and we're looking at those applications, there'll be more iteration and kind of back and forth around what exactly you expect your pilot costs to be and how, what resources or what elements of it you think that you can cover and you can handle, areas where you'll need more help. So there'll definitely be an opportunity to have back and forth around the budget, but in terms of the grant funding, that's a set pool that we're working with through our partners at the EDC. Great. And then another one just came in. So with buildings being one of the largest producers of carbon emissions in New York City, are any of your members deploying or working with building landlords, like multifamily, residential, or commercial, to test innovations in the real world? If so, how do you select landlord partners to work with? Yeah, so maybe I'm happy to start, and Tom, again, feel free to chime in or add on. So yes, this is certainly a top of mind challenge, here in New York City, but really across the world as we think about carbon emissions. We've definitely worked in this area before. I think, as I had mentioned, our Circular City Studio, years ago in partnership with the EDC, actually was looking at, efficiency improvements in buildings for this very reason. So we've definitely had experience working with different kind of small business owners, in the New Lab building itself here, other buildings in the Navy Yard that are interested in technologies or innovations that can help reduce carbon emissions. So certainly this is an element of our innovation studios. We're always looking for real world environments to pilot in, and we love to work with local partners that are interested in kind of testing innovation and being at the table alongside these studios. In terms of how we select, it's a little bit of a kind of, as it comes. We're always out there promoting these opportunities for pilots. And so we're open to kind of, any folks in the local community who have that sort of interest, bandwidth, and capacity to be a test bed and to express interest in that. So there's not a formal selection process. It's more of relationships that we've been cultivating. And certainly as folks come to us interested, we want to we want to make sure we're having a conversation. But maybe, Tom, you can talk a little bit. You touched on this, but I think maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the potential kind of pilot site hosts that we have at the table and how those sites are different in terms of residential versus commercial, or kind of more campus-like, based on some of the folks we have at the table for this studio specifically.
Yeah, totally. First, I just want to also mention in our application, we ask, as an entrepreneur, we ask about your network and if you have any connections. And if you were to have any landlord connections, you could certainly put those on your application. That could be considered as part of the application. Our potential pilot site partners they're by no means the edge of the universe in terms of where we can pilot. We're casting a very wide net here. Those partners just indicated a very specific interest in piloting. Altogether, they represent a pretty wide array of assets, from airport facilities to maritime facilities, to food markets, and just a host of different properties. So there will be a really wide range of different types of buildings to work with and scope out through the studio. And then, of course, I mean, one thing we heard while in our research phase is that many property owners, landlords, just kind of don't know where to start with energy storage. They have a lack of knowledge of, or tools, I should say, to get knowledge about what technologies they should consider, cost mechanisms, and who they should talk to, and all of these things. So we're hoping that outputs of the studio, again, are discourse and tools that can actually be of use to these property managers in the future.
Excellent. Great. I think we're kind of right on time. That wraps up our questions. So maybe Tom, I'll let you kind of close out for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you everybody for joining. I previewed that we have another info session on May 19th. So if there's anyone you think should be at the next one, we'll be sending out an email, or just let us know. And we are accepting applications until June 1st. That being said, we're reviewing them on a rolling basis. So if you feel like you'd like to have some conversations, I'd say submit sooner rather than later. And thank you, Nick, for your attendance, and thank you everybody for joining.
Awesome. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.